I was not just skeptical, I was adamant that this was not happening in my house, and my belief system rebelled against the concept and the idea of reincarnation and past lives.
And now, one of the biggest questions of life. What happens when it's over? Heaven? Hell? Nothing? Or might there be a fourth possibility, reincarnation? Could we come back as someone else? Here's Chris Cuomo with two down-to-earth parents who thought they understood the mysteries of life. That is, until their toddler began to talk.
On March 3rd, 1945, a 21-year-old Navy fighter pilot on a mission over the Pacific was shot down by Japanese artillery. His name might well have been forgotten, were it not for the remarkable, some might say unbelievable story of a little boy named James.
Okay, this is really tough. I need somebody to help me.
All right, I'm the volunteer. What do you want me to do?
Okay, I'm just going to climb this thing, and you have to hold me in case I fall.
Done.
James Leiniger is all boy, 6 years old and full of spirit.
This is a special plane. It goes in reverse. You don't see a lot of that.
James knows a lot about planes, especially war planes.
What kind of airplane is that?
It's a Corsair.
His parents, Andrea and Bruce Leiniger, say from an early age, James would play with nothing else.
He was obsessed with airplanes. If you look around the house, that's all you'll see. Airplanes, helicopters, aircraft carriers.
But then, when he was 2, the planes James loved suddenly began to give him frequent and frightening nightmares.
I'd wake him up and he'd be screaming, and he'd always be laying on his back, kicking his feet up at the ceiling. And I'd say, "Baby, what were you dreaming about?" And he'd say, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out."
They sound like typical kiddie nightmares, but Andrea says they went on the same way for months. Maybe too much TV. But James was just 2, and his parents say only watching Barney and Teletubbies.
Teletubbies!
And Andrea and Bruce say they weren't watching World War II documentaries or conversing about military history.
This is an F-18?
No, that one.
So what explains the nightmares and James's strange obsession with airplanes?
I talked to my mom about it. A lot of times my mom had said maybe he's remembering a past life.
What did you say?
Politely, baloney.
Andrea and Bruce of Lafayette, Louisiana are a highly educated, modern couple. To them, the possibility that their little son James was manifesting signs of a former life was, well, a little out there.
You know, having a past life is not the initial conclusion that you come to. You try and figure out any other way he could have. Did he see anything? Has there ever been anything on television, anything that we've discussed?
But as time went by, Andrea didn't know what to believe. Here's James at age 3, going over a plane as if he's doing a pre-flight check. He would continue to say and do things that were puzzling, like the time his mom bought him a toy airplane.
And I said, "Oh, look, there's a bomb on the bottom of it." He said, "That's not a bomb, Mama, that's a drop tank."
A drop tank?
I'd never heard of a drop tank. I didn't know what a drop tank was.
Andrea's mother suggested she look into the work of counselor and therapist Carol Bowman. Bowman has written 2 books, both supporting the proposition that sometimes the dead can be reborn.
We are taught from a very early age in this culture, in the Judeo-Christian culture, that reincarnation doesn't exist. Once you observe this in a child, and the evidence is very compelling, you have to open up to another explanation for what is going on.
Bruce was deeply skeptical.
He said there has to be a logical explanation.
I don't believe in past lives. I don't believe in this stuff.
But with the violent nightmares recurring 3 and 4 times a week, the Leinigers felt they had to do something. So with guidance from Bowman, they cautiously began to encourage James to share his memories. They say the result was startling.
The nightmares immediately started reducing in frequency. He went down from 3 or 4 times a week to maybe 1 a week, 1 every other week. And at that point was when he started to articulate more about these past life memories.
Seems normal enough, a little boy improving when his troubles are directly addressed. But Bowman says this is more, that James was forthcoming because this is the age when former lives are most easily recalled.
They haven't had the cultural conditioning, the layering over of experience in this life, so that the memories can percolate up more easily. These memories tend to fade between the ages of 5 to 7.
His parents say between the ages of 2 and 4, James would reveal extraordinary details about the life of a former fighter pilot, mostly at bedtime, when he was drowsy.
Bruce said, "What happened to your plane?" He said, "It crashed on fire." And Bruce said, "Why did your airplane crash?" And he said, "It got shot." And Bruce said, "Well, who shot your plane?" And I'll never forget the look on his face. He went, "Oh, the Japanese."
Still, despite these extraordinary stories, Bruce remained dubious. Almost to prove they couldn't be true, he began to piece together the details James was sharing. And what he found, he says, shook him to the core. For in many instances, the stories appeared to match the facts. James seemed to be recalling real events, real people, in the life of a man who'd been dead for almost 60 years. With each passing month, little James Leininger seemed to be peeling back memories of a past life.
Ooh, plane.
Vivid memories that scared and astonished his parents.
Bruce had always said, "What kind of plane did you fly?" And he said, "A Corsair."
Yeah.
He said a Corsair?
He said the word Corsair. Yeah.
Not only did James remember flying a Corsair, he demonstrated knowledge of the plane's peculiarities, like the time he was flipping through a book about planes when he was 4.
And he got to the Corsair and he said, "That's a Corsair." And he goes, "You know what? They used to get flat tires all the time."
In fact, historians and pilots agree that the plane's tires took a lot of punishment on landing. Of course, this is a fact that could easily be found in books or on TV. But then, James began to offer up the kinds of specific details his parents say are harder to explain away.
Another night, Bruce had come in and he said, "Do you remember where your plane took off?" And he said, "It took off of a boat." "Do you remember the name of your boat?" "Natoma." "Do you remember what your name was?" And he'd always say, "James." But his name is James. It never really occurred to us. We thought he just wasn't understanding the question. So I said, "Do you remember any friends or anyone else that you flew with?" And he said, Jack Larson.
Bruce began doing some research. Almost immediately, he discovered that the Natoma was an actual ship, a small aircraft carrier in the Pacific called the Natoma Bay. And Jack Larson, the Navy buddy little James recalled? Well, it turns out there was a pilot named Jack Larson who served aboard the Natoma Bay. In fact, he's alive and well and living in Arkansas.
And it was like, holy mackerel. I mean, really, you could have poured my brains out of my ears. And I just couldn't believe it.
And there were more clues. Around this time, James began signing crayon drawings and other artwork, James 3.
One day I asked him why he's calling himself James 3. Well, it's because I'm the third James. And every once in a while you ask him that today, and he'll still say the same thing.
And one day, while leafing through a new book about the Battle of Iwo Jima, Bruce turned to an aerial photo of the Pacific Island. James was seated nearby.
He pointed to it and he goes, "Daddy, that's where my airplane was shot down." And I said, "What?" "That's my airplane got shot down there, Daddy." And I just went blank. I couldn't say anything.
By then, Bruce had become a man possessed, searching the internet, combing through military records, and interviewing men who served aboard the Natoma Bay. Finally, a breakthrough. He learned that there was just one pilot from the squadron killed at Iwo Jima. That pilot, James M. Houston, Jr. Is this why little James was calling himself James 3?
It just crystallized in my mind. This has to be who we're talking about. You know, my meter of skepticism was starting to go over toward belief.
When little James would describe being shot down, he told of how his plane had sustained a direct hit on the engine.
We had an airplane, and I said, "Well, can you show me where it was?" And he pointed right up to the front of the engine.
That's what makes this man's story so intriguing. His name is Ralph Klarber. Klarber was a rear gunner on a TBM Avenger that flew off the Natoma Bay. On March 3rd, 1945, he took part in a raid near Iwo Jima. As it happens, Klarber's plane was right next to the one flown by James M. Houston, Jr. It was to be Hugh's last mission before leaving for home the following day. As Klarber recalls, the sky was thick with enemy flak.
We experienced pretty heavy anti-aircraft fire, but This was the most intense that I experienced at any time.
Suddenly, a flash near the nose of Houston's plane.
I saw the hit. I would say he was hit head on. Yeah, right on the middle of the engine.
Just as little James had described it.
So what do you believe now about your son James?
I believe that he had a past life. I believe that in his past life he was James M. Houston Jr. And he came back because he wasn't finished with something. And that's essentially what I believe.
Dear Bruce and Andrea.
And he's not the only one. This past October, the Leinegers received a letter from a woman named Ann Barron, the sister of pilot James Houston. Andrea and Bruce had contacted her about their little boy. Barron heard about what young James was saying, and she believes.
All of this is still overwhelming. I can only imagine how it has affected you, but I believe, with my love to you, Anne. The child was so convincing and coming up with all these things that there's no way in the world he could know.
After my husband and I did extensive research based on what James had told us, we were able to determine that James was remembering the life of a fighter pilot who'd been killed during World War II at the Battle for Iwo Jima. His name was James M. Houston Jr. And when his family sent us the initial package of photographs, we were amazed by the striking resemblance between James M. Houston Jr., the fighter pilot who was shot down in World War II, and our own son James.
I think that the parents are self-deceived, that they're fascinated by the mysterious, and they've built up a fairy tale.
Professor Paul Kurtz of the University of Buffalo heads an organization that investigates claims of the paranormal.
He's overhearing conversations of his parents. He's looking at cues. He may talk to his little friends or hear from neighbors. And then this conviction that builds up that, yes, he was this pilot, and yes, he will come to believe that himself.
Do you ever rack your brain and say, gee, I hope I didn't say anything or do anything that put this in James' head? Do you ever question yourself still or no?
No, because we're talking to a 2-year-old. You know, I mean, what am I going to do? Sit him in a corner and say, listen, now we're going to concoct this elaborate scheme, and you're going to imagine that you went through those things.
I knew what he watched on television. I knew what stories I read to him. I'm a protective, first-time Southern mother. There was no other place he could have been getting this information.
Assuming the Leinegers are acting in good faith, what we have here is a classic conflict of faith versus science. Hard facts against beliefs that often can't be easily explained. There's no doubt where Paul Kurtz stands.
People have a right to believe, surely in America, there's freedom of conscience. On the other hand, do you want to believe in something that is false?
So how do you rationalize a belief in anything bigger than ourselves if you have to fall back on science all the time?
Not simply science, on the facts, on common sense.
Once upon a time, the Leinegers might have agreed, but that was before the amazing stories told by their young son forced them to consider the possibilities and to examine their faith.
Whether you believe in reincarnation or not, it's about the eternal life of the human spirit.
That's right.
And that's something God promises to us. There is something else out there after this. It's not over when you die.
James's vivid recollections are starting to fade as he gets older, but among his prized possessions are 2 gifts sent to him by pilot James Houston's sister: a bust of George Washington and a model of a Corsair aircraft. They were among the personal effects of James Houston, sent home after the war.
Do you feel differently about James? Has this changed your relationship with him?
No. We have always felt that he's a special little boy because he's our son. He appears to have experienced something that I don't think is unique, but the way it's been revealed is quite astounding. It doesn't change how we think. I don't look at him and say, that's not my son, that's someone else. That's my boy. Good one.
It might be a natural assumption that it's just Buddhists and Hindus who believe in reincarnation, but would it surprise you to know that 1 out of every 4 Americans, Christians and Jewish alike, believe that souls do return again in different bodies?
I eventually decided to focus on American cases. I took several trips to Asia, but I decided to focus on the American ones for a couple of reasons. One, they don't have the potential cultural influences that might impact the cases from Asia. And 2, I felt like that they could have more impact on people, that they could be harder to dismiss if you realize that it could be happening to the kid down the street. So one in particular that I want to tell you about is one that has gotten a fair amount of press. You may have heard about it. A little boy named James Leininger. The case has been on TV some. His parents eventually wrote a book about their experiences. He's a boy who talked about being a pilot who was killed during World War II, and it's believed that that pilot has now been identified. So his parents are this Christian couple in Louisiana, and his dad in particular was quite opposed to the idea of past lives before this case began. It began when James was 22 months old, and he and his dad took a trip to a flight museum. And James was fascinated by the exhibit of World War II planes to the point that he kept insisting that they go back to it, and he and his dad ended up spending 3 hours at the museum when he was 22 months old. And then a couple months later, around the time of his 2nd birthday, he started having horrible nightmares multiple times a week in which he would be kicking his legs up in the air and screaming, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." And after I spent a weekend with the family going over all the details of the case, and then afterwards I talked with his aunt, who had spent a lot of time with the family. She said you cannot believe how horrible these things were to witness, that it really looked like somebody fighting for his life. And then during the day, he would take his toy airplanes and he would say, "Airplane crash on fire," and he would slam them nose first, bam, into the coffee table. He would do this over and over again, and his parents are apparently tolerant people. Because this is a picture of their coffee table. I don't know how well you can see it, but there are dozens of scratches and dents where he would say, "Airplane crash on fire," bam. So that looks very similar to what we in children's mental health call post-traumatic play, where a child who has experienced or witnessed something traumatic then reenacts the scene over and over again in their play. And when you combine that with his nightmares, he really looks like a child who had been traumatized, but he had not been, at least in this life. And he didn't, but many of the children who describe violent lives show phobias as well. In the unnatural death cases, over 35% of the kids will have an intense fear toward the mode of death. And the other thing that a lot of the kids will do in their play, they will also reenact compulsively the occupation of the previous person. And in James's case, not only did he play with his toy planes a lot, but he took an old car seat and created a cockpit in the closet of his dad's home office. So his dad would be in there working, and James would come tumbling out of the closet as he was parachuting out of his plane. And then his parents were able to have several conversations with him after his 2nd birthday in which he could talk about this stuff while he was awake. What he described was that his plane had crashed on fire, that he had been shot down by the Japanese, and that he flew a Corsair. Now, I'd never heard of a Corsair, but it was a special plane that was developed during World War II. And after this case got some publicity, skeptics said, well, he just saw a Corsair at the museum and the name stuck with him. And in fact, if you go to the website of the Flight Museum, you see that in fact there is a Corsair there. Now, James's dad said there was not one there when he and James visited, so I looked into it and found that in fact his dad was correct. They had a Corsair. It had crashed at a public air show the year before they visited, and then they didn't get a replacement for 3 more years. So that is not where he learned about Corsairs. He also said that he flew off of a boat, and his parents asked him the name of the boat, and he said Natoma, which I think we can all agree would be quite an unusual name to guess for a U.S. aircraft carrier. And in fact, his dad responded, well, that sounds Japanese to me. And James said, no, it was American. So after that conversation, Dad went and did an online search and eventually came across information on the USS Natoma Bay. he printed out the information, and the footer shows the date right here. When he printed it out, 8/27/2000. James was born in April of '98, so this documents that by the time he was 28 months old, that Natoma was part of the story. And it turned out that the USS Natoma Bay was an escort carrier that was, in fact, stationed in the Pacific during World War II. His parents would also ask him who he was during all this, and he always just said me or James, which they didn't make anything of at the time. They also asked him one time who else was there, and he said Jack Larson. This was all when he was 2. Now, when he was 2 and a half, his dad bought a book on Iwo Jima to give to his dad, James's granddad. And he was looking through it one day, and James came and got it in his lap, and they were thumbing through it when they came to a page with a picture of Iwo Jima on it. And James pointed at it and said, "That's where my plane was shot down." And his dad said, "What?" And he said, "My airplane got shot down there, Daddy." And his dad was just floored that his 2.5-year-old was talking like this. And then he learned that, in fact, the Natoma Bay did take part in the Iwo Jima operation. Then when James got old enough to draw, he drew, according to his parents, dozens, if not hundreds of pictures of airplanes and battle scenes, and he would always sign them James 3. Now, I thought that might be because he was 3 years old, but his parents said, no, they asked him, and he said, "I'm the 3rd James, I'm James 3. And in fact, he continued to sign them that way even after he turned 4. So with all this going on, his parents did begin to wonder if he could be remembering a past life. So when he was 4 and a half, his dad attended a Natoma Bay reunion, and he learned that there had been a Jack Larson there. He had been looking for a Jack Larson among the war dead, but in fact this Jack Larson had survived the war and was even still alive. So James's dad went and visited him, and he learned that he was on the ship, on the Natoma Bay, during the Iwo Jima operation. He also learned that one and only one pilot from the ship was killed during the Iwo Jima operation. This was a 21-year-old pilot from Pennsylvania named James Houston. So this means if James Leininger was in fact remembering a past life, it had to be Houston's life because he was the only pilot from the Natoma Bay killed at Iwo Jima. So what we can do is compare what James said with Houston's life. Now his parents say that he also talked about family life before the war, but we don't have any documentation of those statements that was made before Houston was identified. But what I can do is list all the items where we have definite documentation that was made before anyone knew anything about James Houston. Much of it comes from an interview that the Leiningers did with ABC News, again, before anyone knew if James's statements actually matched an actual pilot. So James signed his drawings James 3. Houston was James Jr., which would make James Leininger the 3rd James. James said that he flew off the Natoma. Houston was a pilot on the USS Natoma Bay. James said he flew a Corsair. Houston had flown a Corsair. He was actually flying a different plane when he was killed, but he was part of the squadron that had tested the Corsair for the Navy. James said he was shot down by the Japanese, and Houston was shot down by the Japanese. James said he died at Iwo Jima. Houston was the one Natoma Bay pilot killed during the Iwo Jima operation. James said one day, quote, "My airplane got shot into the engine and crashed in the water, and that's how I died." Eyewitnesses reported that Houston's plane was, quote, hit head-on right on the middle of the engine. James had nightmares of a plane crashing and sinking in the water. Houston's plane crashed in the water and quickly sank. And James said that Jack Larson was there, and Jack Larson was the pilot of the plane next to Houston's on the day that he was killed. James is now 18 years old. He became an Eagle Scout, and he graduated from high school this spring, and he has recently joined the Navy.
he would just be crying. He'd say, airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out. He laid on his back and kicked up at the ceiling, and he goes, Mama, the little man's going like this. And he laid on his back and kicked his feet up. The little man's going, ooh, 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 can't get out. And I said, well, who's the little man, baby? And he goes, me. I thought Bruce and I were just gonna faint.
They questioned, what kind of plane?
Corsair.
Why did your airplane crash?
My plane was shot down.
Who shot your plane?
He looked at me like I was a village idiot. He said,
The Japanese.
He said his name was James.
But his name is James.
Whose plane took off from the USS Natoma Bay and was shot down over Chichijima. The Leiningers hoped to disprove it, but learned it was all real, including a pilot named James Houston. Leo Pyatt served with Houston.
Yes, there was a Jim Houston, a rather large shell, just hit him in the engine, and it burst into flames and went down.
James recognized other shipmates by name and told his mother about James Houston's most treasured possessions and his sisters, Annie and Ruth.
It freaked me out.
This looks like an amusement park ride, but to James, it's a World War II flight simulator. He has more than 50 specific memories. Reincarnation experts call it the most documented case ever.
It's a great case because it is verifiable.
Well, it all started when their young son woke up from a bad dream in the middle of the night. He began recounting stories of a fallen World War II pilot. His mother and father never told him those stories. In fact, they think he may have experienced them in a past life. The Leiningers have shared their son James' story all over the world in hopes of shedding light on what we do not know about the afterlife. And James' story, detailed in the book Soul Survivor, has gained so much popularity it's been translated to 10 different languages. And joining me now are Andrea, Bruce, and James Leininger. Thank you all for being with us this morning.
Anytime.
Certainly, you know, we've been sort of hinting at this story all day, and it gives everyone pause because it seems almost impossible. Andrea, can you go through and tell us about James' story? He was two when he started having these dreams.
Right.
And what happened?
It was just after his second birthday. He started having horrific night terrors, remembering that he was in a plane that got shot down and crashed in the water, and he couldn't get out of the plane. And the behaviors that he had when he was having the nightmares were mimicked somebody who was trying to get out of something. It was like he was trapped in a box trying to kick the lid off.
So it seemed very real. Bruce, when you heard this, though, did you think anything of it? I mean, certainly 2-year-olds have nightmares, right?
Well, it was disturbing because it was 4, 5, 6 times a week. It just wasn't incidental night terror that children experience.
And there were drawings, too, James, that you would make that sort of indicated historic truth, correct? We have some images of those that we can put up. But it was how you would sign them, right? That would give everyone a little bit more information.
That was one of our first clues. He started doing the drawings, and it was almost a pathological process. He would put the planes and the ships, and then he would almost be acting out a battle. He would be shooting and firing, and he started signing the drawings James 3, and it was right when he was 3 years old. He couldn't even sign his name yet. He didn't know how to write his name, which I think people don't realize, that when you're 3, you don't know how to write your name yet.
Exactly.
But he isn't a third James. My husband's name is Bruce, so we kept asking him, well, how come you're signing your name James 3? And he said, I'm the third James.
And what made your parents start researching, James, what that really meant historically? You said the name of another pilot, correct?
I said the names of many pilots from the Natoma Bay, Bob Greenwald, Jack Larson.
Right.
I stated all these names of people that, if only you had been on the ship or you had been able to look at military records, or you knew them personally via family or through just friendships, you wouldn't know that person or their life. And I'm 3, 4. In my very young age is just talking about them.
At 2, he knew the name of the ship. My husband had asked him if he remembered where his plane took off from, and he said it took off from a boat. And he asked if he remembered the name of the boat, and he said Natoma, which is a very bizarre word to come up with when you're 2.
When you're 2. And now, but how do you make the jump from saying, okay, this is some information in my 2-year-old or 3-year-old's mind, to he actually is reincarnated. This person that he's talking about is reincarnated in my son. Right. I mean, how did you get to that point?
Well, he did 3 things very quickly. He gave us the name of the ship. He then told us, he gave us the name of a man that he flew with named Jack Larson.
Yeah.
And then he gave us a location where his plane was shot down.
Sure.
Well, what I found out by contacting a veterans organization, never expecting to confirm this name Jack Larson. I asked a guy named Leo Pyatt, do you remember a guy named Jack Larson? And he says, oh yeah, he flew off one day and we never saw him again. So it led me to believe initially that that's who had been killed. But we discovered later that there was only one man killed during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and his name was James M. Houston, Jr.
James, can I ask you, so you're young when this starts. It seems like an awful lot of responsibility for a toddler to have, to be carrying the life of a World War II veteran. Where, if you can, even just give us a brief glimpse into what that's like, and where are you now? Do you still feel the way that you might have felt at 3, where you're having these visions and occurrences come to you?
Well, I don't have the nightmares anymore.
Okay.
Those passed after we went to Chichi Jima and reconciled the whole, problem with James Houston. I got to say goodbye, and I guess I kind of just made that just spiritual release from James Houston, and so I don't have the nightmares anymore. But a lot of people ask, well, how can something like this, happen? How would you just know these things? And so I kind of give the example, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And some people say, oh, I want to be a doctor. And I say, well, is there anything anybody can say change how you feel about, oh, I want to be a doctor? Some people just have this innate knowledge from birth about, I know a lot about weaponry, I know a lot about the military, and it's just, I don't know where it comes from. Some people just know a lot about a specific subject, but where does this come from?
Or maybe it comes from the exact place that you described.
Exactly.
Do you feel that you can live your own life, or do you feel like you cannot separate the two?
Oh, I live my own life every day. I think about James Houston sometimes. Okay. I recollect on him I just think about him sometimes, but it's not really. I can just live my own life freely.
It's good. James, thanks for being here.
Thank
sharing
you.
Your story, Bruce. Do appreciate it, Andrea.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thanks for sharing your story. Certainly others may have similar ones as well. And we will actually have everyone Facebook us in if you have something you want to share with James.